Hello, my name is Erika Mallin, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Arts Program. Thank you for watching My Name is Pauli Murray, the first film of the 2021 Eisner Lauder New Views documentary and dialogue series presented by the Aspen Institute Arts Program and Aspen Film. My Name is Pauli Murray tells the inspirational story of pioneering poet, author, lawyer, activist, minister Pauli Murray. The film places Pauli's groundbreaking work in historical context and makes clear the debt owed to this incredible trailblazer. We are so pleased to have directors Julie Cohen and Betsy West and producer Talleah Bridges McMahon with us today to discuss this extraordinary individual and film. Welcome.
Thank you, Erika.
Welcome, Betsy.
Thank you.
Julie, Talleah. So before we begin, first, thank you so much for being here and for bringing us this incredible film. Before we begin, I did want to cite your note as the filmmakers of Pauli Murray, where you say, if Pauli were alive today, we do not know what choice Pauli would make about pronouns. So in talking about Pauli, you have chosen to refer to Pauli by name. I will try to adhere to this and try to self-correct any lapses. So let's start from the beginning. How did you set about making this film? Julie and Betsy, I believe you came across Pauli Murray when you were making the documentary RBG. And Talleah, I know you've produced many documentary series on the Black experience and on historic moments such as 1968, the year that changed America, and America since MLK. So, you know, let's start with you, Betsy, in terms of, Pauli Murray.
Yeah, well, absolutely, Erika. Julie and I first learned about Pauli from Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had cited Pauli as a very important influence in the fight for women's equality. Pauli suggested in the 1960s what was then a radical idea. Hey, let's use the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, to help women as well as African Americans. And so after RBG came out, we started to do a little research and realized what an extraordinary person Pauli Murray was, and not just a groundbreaking feminist legal thinker, but civil rights activism, and as you said, extraordinary writer, poet, Episcopal priest, on and on. And we're first of all like, why don't we know about this person? And maybe we could make a documentary. So that's how it started.
So for any of you, but let's start with you, Julie. Okay, so you show us the boxes, the massive amounts of archives, and I can imagine, and also the challenge of doing a documentary with a person who is not alive, but really those boxes were a lot. How do you get to a storyline with that? And did you have an angle going in? Did it change? We all know sort of we start one way and then we end up, going another, right?
Yes, so, absolutely. There were changes and evolution throughout the making of this film, more so than most documentary processes that I can recall. But, we started with a fairly straightforward notion that we really retained throughout the making of this film, which is, let's try to tell Pauli's story in Pauli's own words as much as is humanly possible. Let's come as close as we can to creating an autobiographical film from someone who, fortunately for us, had literally not only written, but recorded on audio tape most of an actual autobiography, as well as, poems that were often audio taped, letters, journals, legal writings, communications. Almost everyone that Pauli was engaged with Pauli was also writing letters too, whether that was, whether that was someone that was a work colleague or adversary, or the New York Times, letters page. Like Pauli, as Karen Rouse-Ross, Pauli's grandniece, who's in our film, says, was, up all night, like banging the typewriter. Actually, to the extent that Pauli was evicted from a number of apartments for like, the 3 a.m. pounding typewriter. So there were words upon which to base our story, although that left, probably like, I don't know, 9,000 different directions that we could have gone, which was both the challenge and the fun of making this film.
So Talleah, in working in this film, and sort of, I'm sure, seeing the various versions of it, is there, were there things like, we have to include this, did we left this out, why, what we should add, what should take out? It's, it's overwhelming, I would say.
Well, obviously we knew going into it that we couldn't tell all of Pauli's story. And so the challenge facing us is like, what is exactly what you're getting at? What is it that we would be including? And so we started by just making a list, right, of like everything we could possibly include, and then talking through, what we would actually end up including and why. And it was very important. Betsy and Julie were very clear from the start that we're really making a case in this film, right? We're saying this is a person you probably don't know, but you definitely should. And so it was really important to us to have those touchstones, those moments that convey that idea. So it's like, you should know Pauli because of these reasons. So there were some very key stories that we knew had to be included. Pauli's activism in terms of protesting on the bus, Pauli's fight to get into UNC, Pauli's role in Brown versus Board of Education, the various roles that Pauli played in the women's movement. So there are all of these things that were like must-haves. And then on top of that, as you were saying about with the archive turned out to be such a rich resource for us. That was one of the wild cards going into it. We had heard that there was a huge archive. We'd read some books, but we didn't quite know what it contained. And so one huge advantage of the archive is that it not only had speeches and letters and various academic writings, but it also had pages and pages and years of diary entries and personal letters to friends. And so that's really, and also like letters to doctors. And so that's really what allowed us to interweave Pauli's personal story into the film as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have the one quote in the film, it's one person plus one typewriter constitutes a movement. And I think that, very much illustrates Pauli's ethic on that. And was there something, again, trying to get a handle on how do you, corral this information? Because I think a lot of people don't always know how documentarians work and how you're not writing a screenplay, right? You can't manipulate the character to a certain extent. Again, it was definitely chronological, but you were able to go into different places. And tell me a little bit, like maybe an example of one moment where you were having a struggle to get from point A to point B, because she really had such an amazing range.
You're right. It was a huge challenge. I mean, you're dealing with, unlike, a fictionalized story, you're dealing with the found material. And so, Talleah first went to the Schlesinger Library and just, started to go through all of this material. And we started to listen to the audio and to figure out what exists and what story. And then we made the very lucky discovery of video, which we felt really, you see that at the beginning of the film, very deliberately, so that we can give you a sense of Pauli's personality, that amazing smile, the sense of humor, the relationship with the dog. Pauli always had a dog. I mean, we wanted to humanize Pauli, and having that video was a tremendous advantage. The other thing I think also was, in terms of making transitions from place to place, the fact that Pauli was such a beautiful writer, and the poetry was just so moving. And as Julie said, there were a lot of things that happened in the evolution of this film. And one of them was that we relied on the poetry more than I think we might have thought we would have at the very beginning. And so you'll see the moments in the film where we used Pauli's poetry as a way to move from one place in time to another.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to focus, you know, as the arts program, I think we wanted to focus on Pauli as a poet, or as Pauli said, poet turned lawyer. And I found some quote, which I'm not sure if it came from the film or, you know, so much I was reading about it, where Murray said, I think the same thing that made me write poetry, the same kind of, I don't know whether to call it fire, the same kind of unrest, the same kind of response to situations made me participate in activities. So essentially what we call today a citizen artist, or, I found, you know, what you did to incorporate Pauli's writing, which meant to me incorporating Pauli's deeply humanistic point of view. How did you come up with that device? And again, I think I was taken by that device because you also put it up on the screen in what I saw was this cadence, like of how Pauli might have said it. And this I thought was incredibly unusual and very powerful. So you started to talk a little bit about that. I don't know if someone else, Talleah, maybe you want to talk about that a little bit, since you were deep into the archives there, sifting through.
Sure. So the way that we were working is that as we were building each story, we were just looking, you know, keeping an eye out for opportunities to include Pauli's writing. And so it was really, and we, you know, as you were saying, Pauli is such a gifted, clear writer, as Pauli is such a talent in that way. And so it really did create an advantage for us as we were working and crafting these stories, as you know, in terms of just being able to clearly communicate what Pauli was trying to clearly communicate. And so as I was saying, we were just looking for opportunities to incorporate Pauli's writing as we were going. And it's something that came to us, you know, as we were working. I think, as Betsy said, it was unclear when we started. We knew we were interested in showing Pauli as a writer. It was unclear when we started how we would go about that, but it became very clear as we were working and crafting these stories and weaving things in and out that we could include much more of Pauli's writing than we originally envisioned.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is trial and error and seeing what works. You start with the notion of like, oh, wouldn't it be great if everything was, you know, on videotape with sound to it? We knew going in that wasn't true. We knew, though, that there was this huge amount of audio tapes. We said to ourselves from the start, like, oh, even if it's just audio, we'll find the images. And our editor, Cinque Northern, did a brilliant job of making you feel like you're not just listening to audio tape, you're actually seeing, you're seeing a film. But what came about, I think, a little bit more by happenstance was realizing, no, actually, sometimes even when there's not video and there's not audio, the words are so powerful that they're going to work without either. And part of it is how they're placed, not only images, but as you say, having them come out in a rhythmic way that's kind of guiding the viewer through reading these words and kind of holding one back and sticking one on at a moment that there's extra punch. And I can say that the four of us spent a fair amount of time in the edit room saying like, no, that word should come out like a half a second later, or like, you know, it really feels good, you know, that's kind of the, that's important when you're trying to, I actually think it was, we had those students at Yale reading that very powerful poem to the oppressor coming out of a scene that's about Pauli's experience as a child becoming aware of lynching in North Carolina. Our thought was, oh, we could skip, you know, can you go from this scene to the students reading the poetry? And Cinque just created a sequence that had the words on their own with visuals and with music. And when the four of us sat there watching that in the edit room, it was so strong that I think we were all like, hey, great, like what other poems can we find that we don't have audio about? I remember a situation of Betsy like, on her cell phone Googling through Pauli's poetry, looking for a particular, like, oh, do we have a transition here? And in fact, finding it.
Yeah.
Well, it was so much of, excuse me, of who Pauli was. And, how could you not in some ways, when we see the film now, it's sort of a, how could you not? But extremely powerful way to tell her story, Pauli's story. As I said, I have been thinking about this film ever since I saw it. And, words or a phrase like hope is a song in a weary throat. I mean, I think if you just listen to that for 1 second or read that for 1 second, Pauli was a brilliant master of words, which Pauli, I think, which speaks to today, and correct, let's see if you agree, Pauli really knew the importance of language. And we know the importance of language, particularly at times of change. So Pauli was not only a decade ahead of her time, she was many decades ahead of her time. What's been the feedback? I'm curious, from those who have seen the film, about Pauli.
I will say that when you're working on a film about someone who most people, I should say no one, because there actually there's been people who have been interested in Pauli for a long time, and that audience is growing. But for the most part, so many people have not heard of Pauli. And in making this film, it's unclear, it's unclear on our side who will be interested, who will respond. And, we had the great fortune of premiering at Sundance, and from then other people have been able to see it, and the response has been fantastic. So I mean, it's very similar to what you see in the film, where so many people are like, how is it that I do not know about this person? It's just so astounding. And we have all these people, as we're sort of like helping to join and build this army of Pauli Murray supporters.
Yeah, I want to jump in just to say, anecdotally, we've found that the younger the person is, the more likely the person is to have heard of Pauli Murray. It does seem as if Pauli's story has resonated with a younger generation. I think partly because of Pauli being a non-binary queer person, and younger people are discovering, hey, we didn't invent this. This is something that people were dealing with before there was a language and what must that have been like? How difficult must that have been for someone like Pauli Murray? And so there's a great interest in Pauli, I think, from a younger generation. And yeah, I mean, mostly people are just saying, why didn't anybody teach me about Pauli? Why isn't Pauli wasn't in my history book in high school? And so it's exciting to get that reaction, because it was sort of our reaction at first, and it's really what we wanted to set
Yeah,
off.
I mean, as the older generation, Pauli going up against Thurgood Marshall's, arguments about separate but equal, I was like, wow, I mean, we revere, him, as, but Pauli had we still do, but then Pauli again, thinking, well, wait, there's, that's one boundary, there's another one here. After you've made the film, and I think this is for all of you, like, why was she under-recognized? Now that you've had the experience of making the film, and maybe you're too close to understand this, but, or to have any insight, but how come?
But, there are a lot of reasons. I think the sort of foundational reason, and that I think is part of our film, apart from one individual's amazing story, is just rethinking the whole assumption that, like, oh yeah, the basic history, our shared history that we all learn in school, is the main thing. And it's not, and we don't want people to come away thinking like, oh, history that I learned in school was perfect, but it was just missing the Pauli Murray chapter. Add that in and everything's just right. I think the point, which was made so nicely by Tina Liu, who's the head of Pauli Murray College at Yale, as it happens now, who's actually an East Asian Studies professor, was saying, like, if you study history deeply, you're going to realize that the most well-known, most esteemed people aren't necessarily the only game in town. And I think in Pauli's case, so much of it was about having so many ideas way ahead of the time. We talk about an idea whose time has come, and inherent in that phrase is the fact there are ideas whose time has not yet come. And Pauli Murray was having a lot of ideas whose time was going to come, you know, either decades later or perhaps even decades after Pauli's death.
And I think it's important to understand that even though Pauli had not expressed to many people, or really any people, that anything about Pauli's struggle with gender dysphoria, dysphoria, or anything along those lines, that Pauli, you know, what we would have said today was trans, that people had an understanding at the time, it seems, of Pauli. They mistakenly understood Pauli to be a lesbian or a queer person. And so, you know, and so people, it seems, most likely held that against Pauli. So I don't think that we should underestimate the role that that played in sort of blocking Pauli out of various opportunities that could have made Pauli more well-known at that time.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
also, there was also, at the top of all of this, Pauli had a certain restlessness. Pauli was moving from one thing to another, was doing the work, coming up with the brilliant ideas, and then moving along in life. And, you know, the biggest example of that, of course, was the decision to become an Episcopal priest, which completely floored everybody who knew Pauli. And yet it was obviously personally satisfying for Pauli, something that Pauli needed spiritually, intellectually, for whatever reason. And so I do think of Pauli as sort of not sticking around with one group long enough to become the leader of that group. That's not really the way Pauli lived life.
That's interesting. I think both of those points are interesting. You know, it's and explains a lot. And I think, and I agree with you that there are so many people that we don't know about in history that, you know, help turn the tide or change the way we think about something. But I do think, as you both said, there were obstacles to Pauli sort of, you know, getting the recognition that was certainly her due, Pauli's due. So what is, you know, we'll sort of wrap this up in two more questions. First, I wanted to ask you guys, how, by doing this film, is Pauli going to influence you and your work going forward? I don't know who wants to take that one first.
I could start.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. I would say that for me, it is very easy when you take the long view. I work on a lot of history projects. If you take the long view of this country, there's a way to become very cynical about the supposed progress that the country is making in terms of racial equality, in terms of gender equality, in terms of rights for LGBTQ people, disabled people, so many ways in which we are not really living up to the ideal of ourselves, the ideal of our democracy. And so Pauli had this way of having faith in the vision of America and the vision of the United States and what it stood for, that Pauli was motivated by, regardless of so many times when Pauli's particular activities and activism did not really pan out. And I found that very inspiring, that really what Pauli showed me is that you have to take the long view for so many of these things, that you can be working towards change and you can be fighting for progress, and it may not come quickly, it may not come easily, but those things do eventually happen. And so that for me was really inspiring.
Yeah, I think she has that line where America, you know, proclaim yourself, you know, do as you're supposed to do.
Right.
So, and I found that, and Pauli did identify as an American. You know, she went to Africa, she came back, and she, you know, wanted to own that, as we all do, but, you know, adjust America. Betsy.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was a humbling, and it was an inspiring experience, as Talleah said, also a humbling experience to learn about Pauli's struggles, and as a, you know, privileged white cisgendered woman, try to understand Pauli's experience and to help give Pauli the voice to tell the story and not impose my own preconceptions about Pauli onto the story. And I think it was, for me, a huge learning experience about someone with a very different life than my own. And, you know, I just feel really lucky to have been able to learn more about Pauli.
Julie?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say really, really the same. And I just, as a really good window at starting to like rethink a lot of history, a process that actually is going on among, I think, any Americans whose eyes aren't completely like, you know, locked shut at this point, to really think like, whoa, like there is a lot, you know, I mean, like, this is maybe not the time for a diner quote, but the great scene where there's, you ever get the feeling there's something going on here that we don't know about? Like there is like, so, you know, there's just so much going on that Pauli had such a 360-degree view of American culture that, and had the foresight to want to be speaking to audiences whose experiences were so vastly different, and really put effort into like, how can I communicate these ideas so that they'll be understood by, you know, across so many divides. And I like, to me, it just felt like it really penetrated. I mean, you know, that poem that I mentioned earlier, you know, to the oppressors, that is such a powerful poem, and that I feel like just the words really still will stick with me.
So on that vein, I'll ask my last question, which is, you know, what is the impact that you want to see from this film? You know, I mean, I could see Pauli's words being plastered on murals everywhere, but you know, in all seriousness, what do you see as that?
Well, we hope the film contributes to what has already started, which is a discovery of Pauli Murray. It makes me very happy to go to a bookstore and to see, you know, Dark Testament there, or any of the biographies, and just to have people be learning about someone I find so inspiring. So I guess that's our big hope.
Talleah?
I would say more, you know, more broadly, and definitely what, you know, what Betsy is saying, I think our personal dream is like, if Pauli Murray could become a household name, that would be amazing. And then more broadly, really along the lines of what we've been discussing, which is that people really should start to, people who aren't, start to really rethink how they perceive history and how they are thinking about the people who we put up as icons, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to take away from the icons that currently exist, but we could expand our notion about who belongs in those categories.
No. Julie, last
No,
word?
I have nothing further. I think Talleah and Betsy have said it.
Yeah, and I am so thankful that you were able to make this film and bring it to us. And I wish you much success, and that Pauli does become a household name. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.